So welcome everybody to this fourth annual YTL Center lecture in politics, philosophy and law. My name is John Tsulis. I'm the director of the YTL Center, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Miranda Fricker is Presidential Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. She previously held chairs in the University of Sheffield and Birkbeck College, London. She's the author of Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, 2007, and the forthcoming book, I take it is forthcoming, not already published, Blaming and Forgiving, the Work of Morality. She's also edited a range of books on themes in epistemology and feminist philosophy. Among other honors, she is a fellow of the British Academy and holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Kent. Professor Fricker is a moral philosopher who is widely recognized to be currently writing some of the best work in the subject. An aspect of the importance of this work is the significance it has for fields outside of philosophy, as well as the way it engages accessibly and wisely with questions of genuine concern to ordinary human beings, rather than the technical and somewhat artificially confected philosophical problems which have all too often been the order of the day in analytic philosophy. She's also widely known to scholars and writers outside her field. When I was a visiting fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, which is an interdisciplinary institution, it was notable that a number of colleagues there, although not philosophers, were familiar with her work on epistemic injustice and were drawing on it in their own research. I mean, consider, for example, that when it comes to the prescription of painkillers, women are systematically under-prescribed compared to men. So even on a matter on which there is supposed to be first-person epistemic authority, and which relates to the fairly simple prudential value of pain, women suffer outrageous epistemic injustice. Miranda Fricker symbolizes the fact that it takes exceptional philosophical ability to develop ideas and arguments such as these that are found illuminating by non-philosophers. It requires breadth of vision and humanity in addition to cleverness. Professor Fricker's forthcoming book on blame and forgiveness brings together the incredibly stimulating ideas she's been developing in recent years on these themes. In the case of these two concepts, she brilliantly exploits a combination of paradigm-based analysis together with state-of-nature explanation to reveal the basic features of blame and forgiveness. Her development of the notion of communicative blame, a form of blame that aims to inspire remorse in the wrongdoer, as the explanatorily basic notion of blame in her Nous paper of 2014 is a landmark of recent moral philosophy. Professor Fricker's lecture today is entitled A Humanistic Discipline, Williams's Naturalistic Philosophy. It concerns the basic idea underlying the thought of Bernard Williams, perhaps the most influential English-speaking moral philosopher over the past 50 years. The lecture is given added interest by the fact that Professor Fricker was one of Williams's doctoral students, and perhaps also by the fact that Williams famously said that there is little point in doing philosophy unless you are really, really good at it. At the end of Professor Fricker's lecture, there will be comments from Professor Mari Mikkola of Oxford and Professor Halvard Lillehammer of Birkbeck. If you feel compelled to tweet about this, please use the hashtag YTLFricker. Miranda.
Thank you so much, John, for that very kind introduction and for the invitation. Thank you all very much for coming and this constrained circumstances we're all in. It's wonderful for me to be here, and I'm going to read this paper, which I've tried to make of interest to those who are familiar with Williams' ethical philosophy and those who don't know it at all. I don't know if I should have succeeded, but I will try. Bernard Williams' ethical philosophy contains an extraordinary wealth of philosophical ideas, both critical and affirmative. Now commonsensical, now intriguing, now exhilaratingly against the grain. A first observation that any reader might make is that it's all expressed in a deceptively conversational style. Deceptive insofar as a conversational style creates an impression of simplicity and easy construction by the reader after she has closed the book, and yet Williams' philosophy is not remotely simple and is famously difficult to reconstruct. Everything seems to depend on everything else without any single element being conspicuously primary, and when one attempts a summary, one invariably finds that one's neglected to factor in some careful form of words that deftly keeps a generalization just this side of a universal claim, or represents a proposition as one worth serious consideration and therefore functioning as a suggestive reason to take the argument in one direction rather than another, but without actually committing to the truth of the proposition in question. A conversational style produced with such dialectical precision and intellectual subtlety makes for the most demanding kind of reading and the most rewarding kind of rereading. Certainly my own experience is that when I reread a Williams text I'd previously imagined I got the measure of, I find it shifts perspectives before my very eyes, so that a feature I'd previously seen as a background consideration now appears sharply focused in the foreground of the argument, or indeed vice versa. This is partly because Williams deliberately leaves many things unsaid. In Philosophy as a Humanistic Discipline, he lampoons a certain analytical style of meticulously explicitating not merely those objections that are actually worth addressing, but rather every single possible criticism, a style which he describes as trying, I quote, to remove and advance every conceivable misunderstanding or misinterpretation or objection, including those that would occur only to the malicious or the clinically literal-minded. This activity itself is often rather mournfully equated with the boasted clarity and rigour of analytic philosophy, unquote. He goes on to characterise a preferable method of writing philosophy, however, and one that I find casts light on his own style. He says this: "Now, it's perfectly reasonable that the author should consider the objections and possible misunderstandings, or at least quite a lot of them. The odd thing is that he or she should put them into the text. One might hope that the objections and possible misunderstandings could be considered and no doubt influence the text, and then, except for the most significant, they could be removed, like the scaffolding that shapes a building but doesn't require you after the building's finished to climb through it in order to gain access." Unquote. The preferred kind of philosophical text described here is one whose surface is undisturbed by gratuitous critical eddies, but rather flows more smoothly, more conversationally, its course defined as much by what's not said as by what is. And this, on the whole, is what Williams' own writing is like, though it must be admitted that he sometimes leaves so much unsaid or inexplicit that the result can be highly compressed and elusive, with the consequence that it's decidedly tricky to interpret. But then again, it is partly the very characteristics of his writing that make rereading his work so rewarding. It takes repeated encounters to at last stabilise one's sense of what the purport of a given argument really is, what the main reasons in favour of it are, and how it figures in his overall picture of things. Reading Williams, one needs to take repeated and different angles of approach for the real shape of any given thought to present itself. A second observation is that while many philosophers over the span of a distinguished career may change their minds about things, so that interpreting their oeuvre is largely a matter of tracing and explaining the reasons for these changes of view, carefully identifying different phases of thought and approach, so far as I can see, Williams really didn't change his mind about anything. Not his ethical relativism, not his cognitivism, not his famous critiques of utilitarianism and Kantianism, not the internality of reasons, not the misguidedness of the entire enterprise of moral theory, nor the idea of moral luck, of retrospective justification, or the destruction of moral knowledge by reflection, or his conception of the limits of philosophy where it borders with history. Name any of his most central, even controversial proposals, and one finds his view of it remain pretty consistent throughout. And for the most part, even the reasons advanced to support it remain just the same. The argument, for instance, that he first put forward in 1974 for the distinctive brand of ethical relativism that he called the relativism of distance, an argument I actually find to be seriously compressed in the wrong place, as I shall explain shortly, remained largely unchanged from its first form in the paper Truth and Relativism, through later discussions of it in his 86 book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, and beyond, too, in the various revisitings of the issue here and there in papers such as Subjectivism and Toleration or Human Rights and Relativism, which are from 1992 and 2005 respectively. There may be a slight qualification along the way, but no real change of view or argument. I find this unchangingness remarkable, in a dynamic, historically engaged and expansive thinker whose work displayed such extraordinary range and erudition, and which overflows 3 decades of philosophy. As a consequence, the considerable development and expansion of his moral philosophy over time is not best visualized, I think, as exhibiting a linear development of twists and turns to be traced and explained by the careful reader. William's ethical philosophy, contrary to appearances, turns out to have an unexpectedly singular conviction at its root, and I'll be proposing that the branching out of his philosophy over time is best seen as the flourishing of different theoretical implications and expressions of that shared root conviction, of which the meta-ethical ramifications are very extensive. Rereading his work, I find, reveals that this basic conviction can be discerned as ever present in his ethical philosophy, early and late, critical and positive, even while that work is also obviously about many other different things into the bargain. While characteristically charged with kinetic argumentative energy on the page, and still more so as he was in personal discussion, William's consistency of philosophical vision, I believe, explains the intriguingly unchanging quality at the heart of his work. It used sometimes to be said of Williams, or at least when I was still a student, I was aware that some people used to say that it was sometimes said, that his contribution was more critical than constructive, more negative than positive. If anyone remained disposed to say this after the publication of Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which certainly does contain a great deal of critical material, I would have already been disposed to argue with them. In that book, he asks, very roughly speaking, is the idea of universal human flourishing sufficient to entail a specific moral life? No, for there's this thing called history which shows that there's more than one way to flourish. What about the idea of aggregate utility? No, again, a doomed attempt at moral accountancy that obliterates the individual shape of a life. What about universal reason of a different stripe, then, construed as delivering categorical moral requirements from bare rationality? No, again, a brilliant yet deeply misguided fantasy, according to Williams, of moral justice, one that we all recognise and live by to some extent, but which we do well to leave behind. These invigoratingly negative answers, however, are essential in building to the book's affirmative theses concerning the existence of ethical knowledge of a non-objectivist kind, achieved through the application of our thick ethical concepts, the preferred epistemic ideal of ethical confidence, which was always ethical confidence that we're justified in having in relation to our specific ethical concept, the fundamentally first-personal nature of ethical reasons that give shape to an individual life, and, most importantly of all for a book with The Limits of Philosophy in its title, the various ideas he advanced there concerning the nature of philosophy's relation to history, and the importance of doing philosophy in a way that's fully conscious of the historical contingency both of philosophy and of ethical life. Well, be all this as it may, however, no one could in any case seriously cast Williams as a philosopher of principally critical bearing after the publication of Shame and Necessity in 1993, let alone Truth and Truthfulness in 2002, not to mention the 3 posthumously published collections of papers in the mid-2000s. And so I won't further discuss the erstwhile notion that his contribution was more critical than constructive. I will try, however, to show something rather more challenging than its simple falsehood. I'll try to show that the earlier and manifestly critical work that vigorously engaged the dominant mainstays of moral philosophy was in fact already rooted in a positive meta-ethical vision that informed the critiques and animated them from the start. In elaborating this claim, I'll aim also to show that, contrary to appearances, Williams' moral philosophy is not best interpreted in a merely coherentist manner, where every thesis is seen as supporting the rest more or less, and with no single idea constituting a primary commitment or foundation. I'll try to show, on the contrary, that it's fruitful to read Williams as having just such a primary conviction, and one that expresses his deepest philosophical instinct about the human condition. It's the conviction that we are, in a far-reaching sense, ethically free. That is, we're substantively free to set our own ends, generating our own values and correlative practical reasons, because the general requirements of rationality, understood chiefly as the avoidance of false belief and deliberative error, are seen to radically undetermine ethical values. The underdetermination of ethical value by rationality in this sense is our ethical freedom, as I'm calling it, and I'll argue that the central and signature theses of Williams' moral philosophy are best read as one or other affirmation of ethical freedom in just this sense. I believe this explains the strangely unchanging quality of his work, even as it grew in ever new directions through his career. For its ethical freedom we find, if we look hard enough, to be expressed again and again in so much of his philosophical writing. Now explicitly, now obliquely, now negatively, now positively, in relation to reasons and obligations, in relation to moral culture, or again, regarding philosophy's relation to history. In order that I might connect this ethical freedom with the chief materials from William's later philosophy that I'll be invoking, I'll sometimes use the throwaway label dialogical freedom instead of ethical freedom, but I use them entirely interchangeably. The chief reason to adopt the more specific label from time to time is to make it absolutely clear that we're not here talking about freedom of the will. That Williams was in a profound sense a philosopher of ethical freedom is significantly obscured by the fact that he was a skeptic regarding the so-called problem of free will. He was skeptical that there was any such problem. One of the places where his thought displays a localized but genuine affinity with that of Wittgenstein, for Williams effectively regarded the alleged problem of free will as what Wittgenstein called a pseudo-problem, that is, a mere appearance of a problem and one that is created by the very process of philosophizing. Williams says this: the traditional metaphysical problem of freedom of the will exists only for those who have metaphysical expectations. Just as there's a problem of evil only for those who expect the world to be good, there's a problem of free will only for those who think that the notion of the voluntary can be metaphysically deepened. In truth, though, it may be extended or contracted in various ways. It can hardly be deepened at all. What threatens it is the attempt to make it profound, and the effect of trying to deepen it is to put it beyond all recognition. The Greeks were not involved in those attempts. This is one of the places at which we encounter their gift for being superficial out of profundity. That's a quote from Williams from Truth and Truthfulness, and Nietzsche from the preface to The Gay Science. Now, the idea of the voluntary can reasonably be extended or contracted, as he says, depending, for instance, on what view one takes of situations of coerced choice. In the archetype of the highwayman who commands your money or your life, there's room for extension or contraction regarding how far the victim's act of handing over the money is to count as voluntary. One might regard it as voluntary because their action flows from their reasoning about what's best to do under the constrained circumstances, or, alternatively, as involuntary on account of the fact that death being the only alternative rather forces their hand. Be that as it may, for Williams, there is by contrast very little deepening of the idea of the voluntary to be had, and in particular it cannot be deepened sufficiently to resemble the metaphysical idea of freedom, that the diminishment of the voluntary by constraint, the metaphysical idea of freedom that's at stake in the supposed problem of free will. One reason he puts forward for thinking that the diminishment of the voluntary by constraint is irrelevant to the alleged problem of free will is that the freedom inherent in voluntariness can be diminished by degrees, as it is by the highwayman. But no one thinks freedom of the will comes in degrees. Free will is all or nothing. For this reason, Williams declares the idea of constraint on the voluntary to be a red herring when it comes to thinking about free will. And yet, if the brand of necessitation imposed by the highwayman is irrelevant to free will, then it becomes unclear what kind of threat to our agential freedom determinism is supposed to represent. This, at any rate, is what he argues in How Free Does the Will Have to Be? No doubt there are other sources for his scepticism about this question, but I won't try to capture them here. For our purposes this evening, the point is simply that the kind of freedom I'm suggesting Williams was essentially always championing, whether in critical or positive mode, was not our metaphysical freedom from causal determinism, but rather our ethical freedom from determination by a fraudulently all-encompassing idea of rationality. In Williams' scheme of things, this freedom needed rescuing from the dungeons of the morality system that denied it, and which he found to dominate so much of moral philosophy. So, how does this most basic conviction that we're ethically free express itself in Williams' work? I will answer by reference to three signature Williams theses: internal reasons, the relativism of distance, and the borders of philosophy and history. So first, internal reasons. Williams argues that nothing can count as a reason of someone's to do anything, without there being a sound deliberative route to find from some motivationally live state, perhaps a desire, perhaps a disposition, that's either already in that person's subjective motivational set, as he calls it, or would be in it were it not for some false belief or deliberative error. Inasmuch as an apparent reason may turn out to depend on any such false belief or deliberative error, it's not a reason for them after all. Our reasons, then, though conditional on our very own subjective motivational set, or S for short, as he called it, are by no means readily determined or known. On the contrary, we can easily be mistaken about our reasons owing to at least three areas of epistemic capacity: that of worldly facts, that of our own psychological states, or through the opacity of what constitutes a sound deliberation in a given circumstance. First, as regards the hazard of factual error, we might recall Williams' example of someone thinking they have a reason to drink the stuff in the glass because they believe it to be gin when in fact it's petrol, and so they don't really have a reason to drink it. And second, as regards deliberative error, someone might think that they have a reason, in this case an all things considered reason, to quit their job, and yet they haven't fully thought through the likely consequences of doing so, and are perhaps forgetting the negative impact on their future prospects in the industry. So far, so Humean. For Hume's two caveats, the generalization that our reasons bear a one-to-one correlation with our actual passions or motivating states were cases of false belief and bad instrumental reasoning. But Williams adds to Hume's two caveats a further thought concerning the second of these. He emphasized that deliberation can often be less than it should be because of a more amorphous failure than one of picking insufficient means to one's end. It might involve a failure of the imagination. Perhaps the person entertaining quitting their job has thought through the impact of their future prospects in the industry, but has not yet vividly imagined the stressful emotional impact on their family. In addition, and in part as a consequence of this point about failures of the imagination, Williams stressed the idea that what someone has a reason to do at any given time may often be significantly less than fully determinate, since either of the main elements might itself be less than fully determinate, chiefly the presence or absence of the requisite motivational state, and the existence of the requisite sound deliberative route, including sufficiently focused imagination. Quite possibly on his picture, a significant indeterminacy in what one has most reason to do at any given time is much more the norm than the exception. This picture of what it is to have a reason to do something involves a substantial but assuredly incomplete rational idealization. On Williams' view, rational idealization reaches as far as ruling out false beliefs and unsound deliberation, but strictly no further, for there is no further idealization to be had on his view. He thought rational idealization simply doesn't reach beyond these things to settle the question of our ends or value priorities, and any pretense that it does is considered a fantasized piece of rational overreach, a phantasm of the absolutist conception of ethical life he labeled the morality system. The prioritization of values that in fact determines our ends is a substantive matter and fundamentally up to us. Again, not in any indeterministic sense that belongs to the free will debate, but simply in the sense of sourcing our value priorities in ourselves, in our particular priorities and concerns, and most importantly, in what Williams sometimes called the ground projects that shape and give meaning to our distinctively individual lives. Williams offers a positive internal reasons justification for precisely this degree of idealization and no more. He explains, the grounds for making this general point about fact and reasoning, as distinct from prudential or moral considerations, are quite simple. Any rational deliberative agent has in his S, his subjective motivational set, a general interest in being factually and rationally correctly informed. Given that we all generally have a motivation to avoid factual and deliberative error, we all thereby have a reason, on his internal conception, to avoid these things. But we shouldn't pretend that there's a similarly universal motivation towards any particular set of prudential or moral ends. On the contrary, even a cursory glance at moral cultural diversity in the now, let alone through history, reveals a noticeably diverse array of ends and value priorities. For this reason, on Williams' scheme of things, any further idealization would represent an outrageous annexation of the ethical by self-styled universal rationality. But what is the difference between the internal and the external theories when it comes to what we should say on the ground in deliberation, and particularly in cases of disagreement about what to do? Is there any real difference at this level? I think there's an important difference. Not in the degree of passion of argument, forms of disagreement or indeed agreement, or general difficulty in determining what to do and how to live. That all looks exactly the same on either meta-ethical picture. But rather in what we're entitled to say at the end of the day, as we might put it, when all arguments have been tried, yet without achieving convergence or agreement. That is, cases of failed attempts at ethical persuasion. In Internal and External Reasons, Williams cites the fictional example of Owen Wingrave, a character he takes from Benjamin Britten's eponymous opera. Owen, whose father died in battle, comes from a proud military family and is under severe family pressure, most especially from his military-minded grandfather, to join the army for reasons of family honour and pride. But Owen has pacifist values and staunchly resists the idea that he has an all things considered reason to join up. Stipulatively, Owen is making no factual or deliberative errors, but simply holds different value priorities from the rest of his family, who are trying to bring him round to their way of seeing things. In such a scenario, and as I say on the stipulative assumption that Owen really has thought it through fully, exercised his imagination vividly and so on, the proper conclusion for the internal reasons theorist to draw is that Owen really doesn't have a sufficient reason to join up. The reasons of family honour and pride that his grandfather may find conclusive simply turn out not to be conclusive for Owen. To insist otherwise is at best bluff, as William puts it, or worse, coercive browbeating. It's at this notional endpoint of proper persuasive efforts that one can imagine a wise third party intervening to say, that's enough. Owen is who he is. I hope it's becoming clear that the internal reasons thesis is a direct expression of what I'm urging is William's deepest philosophical conviction, namely that we're dialogically free. We engage in discussion about what to do, sometimes disharmonious discussion across interpersonal ethical distances that just will not close up, and provided there are no errors of fact or deliberative reasoning, including no failures of imagination, in the situation where no consensus is reached, then the proper conclusion is that the differing parties have different reasons. On this picture, all the normal deliberating and arguing we go in for in order to decide what to do is simply not the kind of activity that permits of only one right answer. There's more than one way to live, more than one equally rational range of value priorities. But external reasons theorists deny this plurality and the rational underdetermination that gives rise to it. The external reasons theorist then denies ethical freedom in the sense that I've spelled out. That is the key difference between the two interpretations of what it is to have a practical reason. And it means that at the end of the day, at the point where all reasonable attempts at persuading Owen to join the army are deemed to have failed, any external reasons theorist who is sympathetic with a grandfather's perspective will say, Owen's still not seeing what he has reason to do. Whereas any internal reasons theorist who's sympathetic with a grandfather's perspective will say, well, I'm very sorry to say, it turns out Owen really doesn't have a reason. The external reasons theorist regards Owen as failing in a relation to rationality. At the very least, his deliberation is rationally non-ideal. The internal reasons theorist thinks nothing of that kind. Rather, she's learned something important about Owen. This understanding of internal reasons as directly expressive of William's philosophical commitment to the reality of our dialogical freedom is supported if we reread internal and external reasons in the light of later work, most especially the discussion of his last book, Truth and Truthfulness, concerning the two rival conceptions of self-knowledge that Williams finds in Rousseau and Diderot, respectively. Williams there explores the essential role of what he calls trustful conversation in the substantive determination of our beliefs. Trustful conversation is dialogue where each party can trust the accuracy and the sincerity of what the other is saying. That is, they can trust each other's truthfulness. Williams exploits Diderot's view of how our psychologies become steadied through trustful conversation with others, so that we may discover what we think, not through introspection, let alone the kind of introspection and isolationism that Rousseau embraced in his eccentric autobiographical project, but rather through a certain kind of ordinary social intercourse. Our minds become steadied, as he puts it, through trustful dialogue with others about what's the case, and this dialogical process involves bringing propositions entertained in the first instance sans propositional attitude, believing or desiring, so that they're brought to settle into one broad attitudinal category or the other. Williams explains this mechanism in Diderot's view as follows. The subject is engaged in trustful conversation with another who relies on him, and the question is whether he can give that person to believe the proposition. In doing that, he may well, in such a case, give himself to believe it as well. It is the presence and needs of others that help us to construct even our factual beliefs." Unquote. But it's not only beliefs that become steadied through trustful dialogue. Williams adds something, apparently merely in passing, that is in fact of enormous significance to his philosophical position, namely that this same process of trustful conversation applies to the construction of our desire-like states. What he says is, it is a further implication of Diderot's picture of the mind that similar factors can help us to construct our desires. If we consider what is involved in this, it can give us also a deeper insight than we have had so far into the nature of wishful thinking, unquote. Now here we simply need to put two and two together, not regarding the question that Williams is immediately concerned with here, namely that of explaining the phenomenon of wishful thinking as a piece of steadying gone wrong so that an item properly destined for the desire category winds up in the belief category, but rather regarding a different question, namely the question of how the construction and discovery of one's desires through the process of trustful dialogue about what's desirable and of value in the world can be put together with the doctrine of internal reasons to produce the result that the process of psychological steadying through trustful conversation is what produces our individual ethical reasons. Recall that Williams' view is that our reasons are a function of motivational states that would be in the agent's subjective motivational set, or S, once any errors of fact and deliberative reasoning are eliminated. What he delivers through Diderot's model is an account of how such items in one's S can be properly generated and or discovered, as he sometimes puts it, through dialogue that's truthful, no errors of fact or deliberation then. We ask ourselves what's of value, which values are more important than others, and of course, what do we find to be important in a non-relative sense too, as we might put it, important simpliciter. We think in dialogue with others about what matters and about what sort of life we want to lead, and that is how our grand projects are first generated. That's how a person like Owen Wingrave comes to know that he really doesn't have an all things considered reason to join the army, even though others evidently do. For Williams, then, our practical reasons are both radically first personal, as he sometimes put it, by way of emphasizing the individuality of our ethical reasons, and yet also fundamentally dialogical in their formation, and in that sense, deeply second personal too. They're generated and discovered through the sorts of trustful conversations through which our psychologies become steadied and our minds are perpetually made up. That dialogical process is the most basic interpersonal process through which we exercise our dialogical freedom and thereby come to our own, sometimes distinctively individual reasons. And we'll come to them dialogically, but not necessarily of a kind conducive to convergence. On the contrary, we might, like Owen Wingrave, engage in trustful, perhaps also fraught and impassioned and difficult conversation that brings us to realize with increasing lucidity that we disagree and that our interlocutor's reasons are decidedly not our own. This is why Williams at one point alludes to the misguided optimism of a Hegelian outlook on which the social construction of individuals guarantees harmony of some basic kind between the individual and society. No such guaranteed harmony is found in Williams, where trustful conversation might equally lead to the kinds of potentially dramatic disharmony that makes for ethical plurality among individuals within a single moral culture, a culture in which different individuals may each cultivate a distinctive shape to their life. This conviction represents no philosophically adolescent fantasy of individual existential freedom to throw away the moral rulebook, but rather a mature acknowledgement of the thoroughly social practice through which our minds become steadied and the socially ramified conversation settles who we are and how we'll live. From this positive picture of what it is to exercise our dialogical freedom, the central criticism in Williams' famous critique of the morality system simply follows. The forms of objectivist moral theory, such as Kantianism and utilitarianism, that exemplify the morality system, do so essentially because they embrace an external interpretation of what it is to have an ethical reason. For Kant, moral reasons are understood as categorical imperatives, and these are defined precisely as arising in a manner that transcends any desire-like states in the moral subject. For utilitarians and other consequentialists, proper reasoning about what to do derives from external facts about consequent aggregate happiness or other kinds of well-being, which themselves have nothing to do with the subject's own motivational states, except insofar as these may contribute to the overall calculus. In this observation, I believe we arrive at an essential respect in which William's critical philosophy can be seen to be animated by a positive metaethical vision. And this illustrates my more general point that his ethical philosophy is best understood as the unfolding of a multiple, differently focused expressions of the single fundamental idea that the constraints of rationality leave us substantially free to determine our own ends. Okay, so that's enough about reasons. Now turning to his ethical relativism. We see the same affirmation of dialogical freedom expressed again in this connection. Only in the case of ethical relativism, it's of course applied at the cultural level rather than the subjective level. The main arguments he explicitly sets out for this kind of relativism apparently hinge on a psychological condition relating to the possibility of a group from one moral culture being able to convert to the alternative moral culture, or at least most of its values, without losing their grip on reality and without losing the ability to make retrospective sense of that conversion. This broadly psychological condition is offered as marking a boundary between what William calls real confrontations and merely notional confrontations between different moral cultures. Here's how he introduces that distinction. A relativist view of a given type of outlook can be understood as saying that for such outlooks, it's only in real confrontations that the language of appraisal, good, bad, right, wrong, and so on, can be applied to them. In notional confrontations, this kind of appraisal is seen as inappropriate and no judgments are made. Unquote. Yet it seems to me now that the psychological condition actually does next to no work in the real structure of this view. Why, after all, would anyone think that the psychological and practical possibility of converting to live according to the relevant alternative values poses a proper limit to moral appraisal of them? The possibility of conversion per se seems neither here nor there as regards the propriety of moral appraisal, not least because it's clear that there are moral cultures in the present to which a group of us would surely not be able to convert, keeping our grip on the situation and making retrospective sense of the conversion and so on. And yet Williams quite rightly insists that relativism finds no application in these cross-cultural cases. He says, for instance, quote, relativism over merely spatial distance is of no interest or application in the modern world. Today, all confrontations between cultures must be real confrontations. Now, this asymmetry in his view between cultural distance on the one hand and historical distance on the other, though in itself a sound one, I think, does not cohere with the criterion of moral conversion that he's given us. It's fortunate, then, that an alternative interpretation of his line of thought recommends itself. I contend that the idea that's really doing the work in Williams' relativism is something not psychological at all, but rather functional, regarding the ability to exercise our basic dialogical freedom to construct ethical values that we live by. This essential motivating idea for the relativism of distance flies by in a sentence or two pretty early in the original paper, so that one has to catch it on the wing. The idea is this: any moral appraisals delivered across merely notional confrontations would contain, and I quote, so little of what gives content to the appraisals in the context of real confrontations that they lack the relation to our concerns which alone gives any point or substance to appraisal. In effect, Williams is saying that the deliberative point of moral appraisal goes missing across merely notional confrontation, inasmuch as the alien moral culture cannot represent a partner in the sort of imagined dialogue that informs our own deliberations about how to live. The implied conclusion is that any such moral appraisal could only constitute an exercise in idle moral grading, which petty moralism is bound to detract from an alternative or more constructive attitude we might take towards distant ethical cultures. Williams modelled for us just what such an alternative, non-moralistic stance could be in his study of ancient Greek ethical thought presented in Shame and Necessity. Here, his project was to counter a certain progressivist orthodoxy to the effect that our characteristic modern phenomenology of wrongdoing, namely guilt, is superior to its allegedly simpler ancient counterpart, namely shame. Williams argued that the Greek notion eidos, translated as shame, in fact already incorporated the desirable complexity found in modern guilt, namely the internalization of the shaming gaze, so that this form of moral compunction is revealed as not dependent, after all, on actually being caught in a shameful state by others, since the agent's own internalized sense of the reaction is already sufficient. Oedipus's dreadful act of dashing out his own eyes gruesomely dramatizes exactly this point about internalization. For in blinding himself physically, he still cannot make himself blind to the horrifying fact that, through no fault of his own, he'd married his mother and killed his father. There's no hiding from internalized shame, any more than there is from a post-Christian notion of guilty conscience. In revealing the psychological complexity of eidos, Williams embarrasses the progressivist reflex concerning the superiority of modern moral psychology, and he simultaneously models the historically reflective kind of philosophy that he always promoted and came later to label impure philosophy, that is, philosophy that mixes itself with history. Acknowledging, if not in so many words, at the outset of Shame and Necessity, that we're in merely notional confrontation with the ancient world, he observes, "We cannot live with the ancient Greeks, or to any substantial degree imagine ourselves doing so. Much of their life is hidden from us, and just because of that, it's important for us to keep a sense of their otherness, a sense which the methods of cultural anthropology help us to sustain." What we can do, through the study of ancient Greek ethical thought, is learn something about our own ethical life and our own philosophical conceptions of it, our blind spots and philosophical fantasies, and perhaps also, one might hope, some distinctive strengths, though Williams doesn't really mention any of them. And so later in Philosophy and a Humanistic Discipline, he laments that on the whole, philosophers tend not to think much about history of philosophy, quote, "because it's not part of a philosophical undertaking as locally understood to attend to any such history. But, and this is the point I want to stress," says Williams, "we must attend to it if we're to know what reflective attitude to take to our own conceptions." Indeed, the alternative positive vision of ethical life that Williams surely gained from studying Greeks as an undergraduate equipped him with a clear-eyed vision of the self-deceived aspirations of the morality system, as he saw it, that he regarded from the start as inflated with objectivist and ahistorical fantasy. That the morality system itself partly constitutes a historically contingent formation of ethical life was, I believe, simply manifest to Williams because he greeted its philosophical expressions already primed with a rich sense of the ancient outlook that preceded it. His acquaintance with ancient styles of ethical thought, and especially the Greek sensibility's capacity to confront the role of luck in ethical life, put the hyper-reflective, absolutist, and ahistoricist predilections of the dominant strand in modern moral philosophy in revealing critical relief. To sum up these remarks about Williams' ethical relativism, my suggestion has been that the real, if fleeting and unhelpfully backgrounded, argument for the relativism of distance, and indeed the marker between real and notional confrontations on which it depends, does not rest, after all, on the psychological possibility of conversion, but rather the deliberative possibility of engaging in real or imagined dialogue as a means to determining our own values. That is the line of moral appraisal. That's the line that moral appraisal cannot appropriately cross. And the impossibility of conversion, though sometimes a byproduct, is in fact a red herring. Certain kinds of historical distance are simply too great to sustain imagined conversation of a kind that could help us answer the Socratic question with which Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy opens, namely, how should one live? The relativism of distance is really, and despite appearances, a direct implication of the idea of dialogical freedom that I'm endeavouring to reveal as Williams' foundational meta-ethical conviction. Moreover, this interpretation is supported by the fact that it helps vindicate the otherwise distinctively undermotivated asymmetry in Williams' view, as I mentioned earlier, between historical distance and merely cultural distance in the now. But when we have to negotiate alien moral cultures in the present, we're always already engaged in the practice of dialogical freedom, thinking through how to relate to the foreign values, perhaps challenging them, perhaps being somewhat changed in the light of them, and so on. And that provides an excellent reason why relativism simply finds no application across moral cultures in the present. The ethical conversation is already up and running, for once the question of another culture's moral otherness has arisen for us, we're already in the deliberative business of deciding what to think, whether to change, or what to do about their values in relation to our own. This is the sense in which, as Williams sometimes put it, it's always too late for relativism across cultures in the now. So that's it for his relativism. and last section, the borders of philosophy and history. Well, my third signature thesis from Williams that I wish to relate to his belief in our ethical freedom is more of a limiting case. For Williams' work was always deeply about the relation between ethical freedom and various kinds of necessitation. His abiding fascination with the limits of philosophy and its relationship with history just was a fascination with the relation between one kind of necessity, those generated by a priori inquiry from the armchair, and the kind of contingency displayed by us as we exercise ethical freedom in real time and social space to create moral culture. Thus we come to his work in State of Nature Genealogical Explanation, which was the method he explored in his final book in order to incorporate both necessity and contingency in a single framework. This method, or rather the state of nature part of it that depicted origins, delivered certain constraints on ethical freedom by revealing that some values, notably for Williams' truthfulness and also freedom, elsewhere he made a similar sort of argument in connection with natural freedom and political freedom, are necessary in the sense that they will inevitably arise in any human society, for the excellent reason that they arise out of absolutely basic human needs. In the case of truthfulness, a compound of the proto-virtues of accuracy and sincerity, the basic epistemic need to pool information means that any society is bound to have a proto-virtue of truthfulness. So far, so necessary. But then history kicks in, and everything that follows is contingent. The specific form that a culturally specific virtue of truthfulness may take will be many and various, perhaps as a value that's profoundly related to ideas about an authentic self, or perhaps a value that's conceived primarily in relation to a notion of honour, or perhaps a value whose role in society is far more bureaucratically conceived, being thought of principally as serving efficiency and reliable information sharing. Necessity and then contingency, philosophy and then history. The State of Nature genealogical method posits original necessities and then lets go, making room for all the historical contingency in the world. On this picture, our basic human nature and social needs as we begin to form a proto-society do constrain what form a human ethical life might take, but really not that much, for there's so much room for cultural difference, and within that, individual difference too. That's why Williams embraced the State of Nature genealogical method, and as I'd now like to put it, the deliverances of the State of Nature story specify the limiting conditions on our exercise of ethical freedom. We start with basic societal needs that mean we must have some proto-virtue of truthfulness or some proto-value of political freedom, and then our ethical freedom takes over, and we're in the everyday business of making history by setting our ends and by way of ramified dialogical engagements that steady our minds and thus our subjective motivational sets. There's a special connection between Williams' late concern to vindicate and explain the utterly fundamental value of truthfulness and his early critical work deconstructing the morality system. In a sense, his critique was always centered on the idea that the morality system was insufficiently truthful, and indeed riven with objectivist fantasies, a word he often used in that connection. Accordingly, a central first-order normative message for our profession that comprises a significant part of the initial rationale of his book, Truth and Truthfulness, is precisely that we should resist fantasy in intellectual life. We have an ordinary but important responsibility to be truthful. Williams said, for instance, truthfulness implies a respect for the truth. This relates to both of the virtues that are the two basic virtues of truth, accuracy and sincerity. You do the best you can to acquire true beliefs, and what you say reveals what you believe. The authority of academics must be rooted in their truthfulness in both these respects. They take care, and they do not lie. Now, an important aspect of taking care is the self-discipline of resisting philosophical fantasy. I believe a sense of this general intellectual responsibility was always the impetus driving the early critiques of the morality system. The responsibility to resist moralistic and universalistic fantasy, to debunk the implied external interpretation of what it is to have a reason, to critique how the associated institution of blame, as he called it, functions to perpetually recruit others into shared reasons under the truthless idea that all ethical reasons were already and necessarily shared. It was only in Truth and Truthfulness that he gave the full elaboration of this idea, but the method in the earlier critical work was precisely that of resisting philosophical fantasy in favour of a naturalistic realism about where our values come from. Where they come from is, in some cases, the basic necessities of human beings living together, This is so with truthfulness and freedom, for instance. But thereafter, they come contingently from what I'm inclined to call our practice of ethical freedom. We might say the practice of ethical freedom consists in our substantive and socially embedded trustful conversations about different kinds of value, including those related to our ground projects, which provide the sense of purpose that makes a person's life distinctively their own. Let me end with a final note of explanation regarding my own interpretive methodology in relation to these themes. In my partly strict, partly experimental exegesis of three pillars of Williams' metaethics, the internal reasons thesis, the relativism of distance, and the relation of philosophy to history, I cannot for one moment pretend to have given you the truth, singularly conceived, about what Williams thought or intended in his writings. But any idea of serving up a single true interpretation would involve a basic misconception, not only of my own purposes, but far more interestingly, a misconception of the character of Williams' highly distinctive philosophical texts. Williams' philosophical writings, though disciplined and purposeful, are generally what one might call resistant texts, in the sense that they actively resist attempts to rigidify their significance. This is facilitated by their often compressed and elusive quality that I noted at the outset, but that's not the whole explanation. What creates their resistant nature is also that many of his ideas resonate in strikingly different ways, depending on what other ideas within his philosophy one considers them in relation to. I've mainly put two cardinal early ideas in relation with later ideas, critiques in relation with positive philosophical proposals, and I hope to have thereby substantiated my interpretive claim that we should understand Williams' metaethical oeuvre as the gradual expansion and elaboration of one core commitment, namely that how we should live is underdetermined by rationality, a conviction he elaborates now by reference to reasons, now by reference to the contingency of moral culture, and now by reference to the idea that philosophy should be aware of its borders with history in order that it may trespass intelligently and self-reflectively in the manner of impure philosophy. There's no question of any singular exegetical truth being offered here, then, but instead, and in keeping with Williams' own view of the place of truth in historical interpretations, I've drawn upon some fairly plain truths, as he calls them, concerning ideas he manifestly committed to on the page at various times, while adding some new interpretive notes sounded by putting those ideas into explicit relation with one another. These new relations exemplify the changeability of philosophical resonance that I find so remarkable in Williams' writing, and deeply characteristic of his philosophical style. The result is a reading of three of Williams' key metaethical theses as sourcing their first energy in an affirmation of our freedom to set our own ends, underdetermined as they are by the bare strictures of rationality. This freedom, and even more so its philosophical affirmation, already present if off stage in the early critiques of the morality system, expresses an irreverent energy that Williams surely recognized and relished in Nietzsche. But in Williams, the deconstructive spirit is already infused with a positive vision in which the ideal of truthfulness and resistance to philosophical fantasy is advanced as a cardinal virtue. And in Williams, the Nietzschean irreverence is transformed into the distinctively socialized dialogical form that brings it to maturity and civility through the interpersonal tutelage of trustful conversation. This practice of dialogical freedom is what I've been proposing determines our reasons and ourselves in Williams' vision of ethical life. My aim, then, in offering you the foregoing interpretive proposal is to produce not something anyone might sensibly describe as truth, but rather truthful. At least I do hope so. For in this connection, as in many things, William was surely right. When all is said and done, what matters most in philosophy, as in life, is truthfulness. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Miranda, for giving us a strikingly original interpretation of Williams's notoriously elusive moral philosophy in the idea of dialogical freedom, perhaps crudely put existentialism with a dose of Habermas, but no doubt that is too crude. But as you say, what facilitates the exercise of such freedom is trustful conversation, which is what I want to proceed to next, thanks to our two distinguished commentators, having suffered the discrimination of alphabetical order all my life, I'm going to proceed in reverse alphabetical order. So our first commentator will be Mari Mikkola from Oxford. Mari.
Thank you. So thanks so much, Miranda, for the talk. In the talk, Miranda, you offer an interpretation of Williams's three key meta-ethical theses that you say all share this kind of a root conviction, that it's fruitful to read Williams as having sort of primary conviction that, this is quoting from you, that expresses his deepest philosophical instinct about human condition, whereby we are in a far-reaching sense ethically free. And so this means that we're substantively free to set our own ends and generate our own values and correlative practical reasons. So in the paper you ask, how does this most basic conviction express itself in Williams's philosophy, and you give these three theses, namely internal reasons, the relativism of distance, and the borders of philosophy and history. So I won't be challenging you on Williams' exegesis, and you are much more qualified to do that than I am. However, I did wonder, given the title, what exactly was naturalistic about this naturalistic philosophy. And I wanted to offer some suggestions how we might conceive of the naturalism, and invite you to tell me whether these indeed do fit your interpretation of Williams. So in the internal reasons discussion, sort of what it made me think of is non-ideal theory, as this is usually discussed in feminist philosophy and in anti-racist philosophy. So in the kind of discipline that I come from and the sort of work I do, so naturalizing approaches are typically wedded to the idea that we are that we should be focusing on the actual human conditions when we are doing our philosophizing, rather than some ideal conditions. And in that sense, the thought is that even though it's not always clear what it means to be engaging in non-ideal theory, many people in feminist philosophy and philosophy of race claim to be doing that. And that seems to at least involve rejecting some methodological tools that marginalize actual states of affairs or even exclude them from our theorizing. And so one of these tools is idealization, that played a prominent role in Rawls's theory of justice. And the way that Honora O'Neill has characterized this sort of idealization sort of roughly has a two-step process. First, we sort of posit a description of ideal states that are kind of well-functioning and perfectly just. And these conditions are only, or this description is only satisfied by hypothetical societies, not the actual one. And the problem, therefore, for O'Neill is that what we've done is it's not that we've abstracted away from the reality too much, but we've actually posited too many kind of false things into our conception of a just society. And then the second step is that we take this idealized picture, and then we sort of have that as the standard for actual social or actual societies and social practices. And the thought is we kind of look at whatever the social and moral sort of pathologies are through this kind of ideal lens. So let's first fix sort of ideal, just societies, and then look at the world and see in which ways does the world actually kind of fall short of this ideal. And then those social conditions will be characterized by injustice. So it seemed that much of the way that you talked about Williams and the critical part of his philosophy seemed to have a very kind of similar, sort of in the similar spirit, is that we don't kind of posit some ideal through which we look at our moral lives, but rather we sort of start by looking at kind of the actual conditions in which we find ourselves ethically. And similarly, you sort of talked about how Williams is opposed to universalism, and that sort of in the root conviction, and that seemed also to be kind of viewed in non-ideal naturalistic manner, namely that Williams kind of describes more accurately and closely the sort of actual human conditions and doesn't appeal to distorting idealizations in grounding his metaethical position. And finally, the kind of non-ideal theory that I'm interested in resonated with me very much when you talked about how Williams focuses sort of concerned with cases that involve failed attempts at ethical persuasion. So we start very much kind of not looking at what the actual situations are that we find ourselves, but really looking at the non-ideal cases where sort of ethical persuasion has failed and something has kind of gone wrong in our ethical positions. So we basically start, or perhaps even privilege the kind of non-ideal cases, and then we kind of look at the social and moral pathologies, sort of starting from that point rather than some idealized position and look at the world and through that. So I wanted to, perhaps the invitation is, does this, in your view, also fit what you say, or have I, or not?
Great. And our second commentator is Professor Halvard Lillehammer from Birkbeck.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay. Just over 20 years ago, I was a part of a reading group here in King's, downstairs somewhere in the corridors of this building. And one of the texts we read was a book by Adrian Moore called Points of View, which attempts to make sense of the work of Bernard Williams, and in particular his idea of the absolute conception and the idea of something being visible or knowable from a perspective. And one of the participants in that reading group was Miranda Fricker. And I remember learning a lot from her, talking about Williams all those years ago. So it's particularly pleasurable for me to come back here all these years later to do so again. And I've enjoyed her talk enormously. For those of us who've read some Williams, I think a lot of the things that Miranda says about him in her talk should be familiar and unsurprising. In particular, the way in which he tries to bring various strands of his work together without imposing a very strict theoretical structure on them, because that would be something that Williams himself would probably have been quite skeptical about. So on the whole, when I was listening to Miranda's talk today, and also had the opportunity to read it before, it was resonating with me very well, and there were not that many surprises. But the one element of surprise that there is, I think, at least stands out, and I think in some way that's the distinctive feature of this paper, is the idea that we should identify Williams as a philosopher of freedom, or as a philosopher of dialogical freedom. I think that's, in some senses, part of the headline news of what Miranda has offered us today. So I want to say a couple of things about that, not by way of disagreement, but by way of raising three questions, which I think it's worth asking about that idea, and not because there aren't any answers to it, but because we should have those answers. So the first questions I would like to ask about that idea is, supposing that Williams is a philosopher of freedom, is there a sense in which there is something that we are being liberated from in his philosophy? And if so, what is it that we're being liberated from? Is it a philosophy of liberation as well as a philosophy of freedom? I think that's an important question. And I think the answer to that question is relatively clear, and I think it's very much at the surface of Miranda's talk and paper, which is that what his philosophy liberates us from is a coercive, overly technical, theoretical, rationalistic conception of morality, to which he presents an alternative. There's a sense in which we are not bound in that particular way. So this is, referring back to the introduction, this is the existentialist Williams. The person who considers themselves as bound by morality conceived as something that is a rational constraint is either deluded on this view, or if they have been fortunate enough to work out that morality is not like that, they're living in philosophical bad faith. So there we got Sartre in, an existentialist in there, although I think Williams was probably less influenced by Sartre than he was by someone like Nietzsche, who Miranda briefly mentions in her paper. So that's the first question. The second question about freedom is, supposing we're talking about freedom, in what sense is the ethical freedom, the dialogical freedom that is proposed to us, a meaningful sense of freedom? Here I think the question is a little bit more complicated, because the way it's being presented, both by Williams and accurately by Miranda, is in largely negative terms. The idea is that practical reason underdetermines our values, that values are indeterminate. These are, broadly speaking, negative descriptions. And that relates, interestingly, to some other and more familiar discussions of freedom in terms of, broadly speaking, the language of the negative and positive. And one of the criticisms people often make about, broadly speaking, negative descriptions of freedom is that they are not enough to deliver the goods. In order to give us a sense of freedom that we should value, something that is meaningful to us, it has to have some kind of substantive, positive content. So one question we should ask Williams on this view is, what is it in his view that makes this sense of freedom meaningful, or how can it be meaningful? One possibility is that there are particular circumstances and preconditions that need to be put in place in order for the freedom he describes, on broadly Humean terms, to be meaningful for us. Most obviously, there are certain kinds of psychological capacities we need to have, but also we need perhaps to be socialized in certain kinds of ways. We need to have certain kinds of opportunities to have these truthful, trustful conversations in a way that allows us to construct these values in ways that are worth having. After all, we could have plenty of conversations in the dungeon without there being much of value to be found down there. So there is an interesting question here about how to build up a conception of freedom on Williams's terms that is, in some sense, meaningful. So that's the second question. The third question is really about the term freedom as such and how confident or literalistic we should be about attributing that term to Williams as someone who should be identified as a philosopher of freedom. So perhaps the provocative way of raising the question would be, well, if Williams is a philosopher of freedom, why doesn't he just say that he is a philosopher of freedom? Why do we have to dig around to find that he's a philosopher of freedom? Now, I think Miranda has said some very interesting things about how Williams philosophized, whereby you'll find that that's not the sort of thing that he would do. And that is a good answer to that question. However, it is worth remembering that Williams himself would probably be the first to admit that freedom is the kind of word that has been used by philosophers in so many ways, for so many purposes, that stretching it around in these particular ways, almost like acrobats, is something we should be very skeptical about. You know, here's the freedom we need to show that God can sentence us to eternal damnation for our bodily sins. Here's the freedom we need to show that the state can coerce us so that we can be truly free. Here's the freedom we need to justify the capitalist transactions that make some people rich and other people poor, all appealing to the notion of freedom. So what is it that makes the notion of freedom, or the idea of freedom, or the term of freedom, suitable to attribute to Williams? And I think a number of the things that Miranda says in her talk begin to answer that question. I think the liberationist element that I talked about earlier in response to the first question is one reason why you might want to use the word freedom here. Another one is the idea of construction, that values, ways of life, things we're committed to are things that we are, as it were, making ourselves. There are no external constraints apart from our circumstances that force us to do so in one way or another. And finally, there's another element which Miranda doesn't talk about in her paper, which he could have done if it had a fourth section, which is related to Williams's politics, some of the things he wrote later on in life. There's a link between that and some of the things that she talks about in the paper, in particular with respect to the idea of values being underdetermined and practical reason being in some sense content neutral with respect to what it delivers. One way of cashing those things out practically is to adopt a broadly liberal conception of how we should relate to each other. And there's a sense in which some of the things Williams was doing in his later work on politics was to develop perhaps a cautious, or perhaps the right word is a fearful form of liberalism. And maybe that's another way in which we should think of Williams as a philosopher of freedom. Either way, I think there are plenty of things in the paper that we can use to answer those questions, and there might be other things too, but I think they're questions we kind of need to have an answer to in order to feel confident that we now have Williams with us as a philosopher of freedom. Thank you.
So many thanks to both of you. That's a rich set of reflections, Miranda. You shouldn't feel constrained to answer all the interesting points, but maybe some of them.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes, I won't be able to pick everything up, but wonderful to have your comments. Yes, Mari, on there's an interesting question about ideal theory. So far as I know, Williams didn't
particularly express a view one way or the other on ideal and non-ideal, and in a way that distinction has really come to the fore more recently since he died. But I agree with you that, he looks like he looks like he's likely to fall on the sort of preference for the non-ideal side, if you like. But I don't think he had anything against ideal theory, including especially ideal political theory. But he thought that the normal kind of political and ethical realism needed to come in at some point. So I don't think he... his beef with normal, as it were, the enterprise of moral theory, if we might call it that, much of which he dubbed the morality system, was in part, wasn't itself that it was ideal theory, it was that it was ideal theory done in a way that was completely unrealistic and never, as it were, brought down to ground to actually get rid of what he regarded as these various fantasies. And I suspect, now I'm just making stuff up, but I suspect that he would have been sympathetic with the idea that, in general, a good way to do ethical philosophy is ground up. And so you allow the ethical reflection to grow out of ordinary first-order ethical reflection, thinking about how to live, what's more important than what, etc., and then take it from there. And in that sense of theory, he was up for ethical theory, and there's no reason to think there couldn't have been a place for ideals and utopian ideals circulating in those discussions. But what he was very much against was projects of moral theory which had these objectivist and externalist presumptions built into them. Perhaps that's all I know time is short, perhaps that's all I should say about that. So Halvard, what can I pick out? We mentioned so many different things, but what did Williams think we might be being liberated from? This idea of a philosopher of freedom, that's my conceit for this paper. I don't know whether he would have been comfortable with that idea. I wanted to bring it out because I think the importance of what I'm calling ethical freedom in his philosophy tends to be concealed and disguised by his skepticism about free will debate. But I don't presume there's, as it were, a single thing he thinks we need liberating from. Within my interpretive thesis, what we need liberating from is something within philosophy, which is the fantasies of the morality system. That's a sort of first answer. But there is something else, too, which perhaps is more interesting, and I didn't say it in the paper, which is that I think in general, and this comes out very much in Truth and Truthfulness, but like almost everything in his work, it sort of features in the postscript to Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which is an extraordinarily condensed little sort of kernel of many things that he thought. Part of his project all along, part of his interest all along, was how far can we retain genuine moral conviction even while we succeed in being clear-eyed about where our moral values come from and the contingency of the ethical concepts we happen to have. And in addition, something further he thought, their origin in broadly instrumental ideas. And that's the project of Truth and Truthfulness. So we begin, what he cares about there is, can we do it? Can we trace back and see, well, in the beginning, where does truthfulness come from? Well, it's basically kind of all in our interest, the kind of enlightened self-interest that we come to. It's useful for us to develop the idea that there are virtues relating to truthfulness, because we need, if we're going to survive, to be able to pool information and so on. In this, he was profoundly influenced by Edward Craig's book, Knowledge and the State of Nature. And also, of course, it's pure Hume, this part. How are we going to make this transition from instrumental, kind of enlightened self-interest towards something genuinely moral? And I think that was a kind of... he felt that question hadn't really been answered, and he was going to try and contribute to an answer to it, and that the fact that we hadn't answered it created great anxiety. That I think he believed that, in general, one of the anxieties that structures a lot of ethical philosophy, and Rorty is very much sort of in the picture here, is, if it's not all really objective, then we've got nothing. And if we discover that our values actually come from kind of instrumental reasons in the beginning, then we've got nothing. And he thought that was the fundamental all or nothing mistake that we see replayed in all sorts of different places in philosophy. And one might say one sees it very noticeably replayed in all sorts of postmodernist thinking. It's a kind of philosophy of disillusionment. And he thought, this is me being a bit glib, but I would say he thought we needed liberating from that. And the way to liberate ourselves from that anxiety is to see if you can make out the case. Look, this is how it starts. Human beings form a society, and having these values creates certain sorts of interest, and it's in our social interest to bring pressures to bear so that we think of X as an intrinsic value. That's all there is to it being an intrinsic value. We need to think of it intrinsic, and we can pull off the business socially of constructing it as intrinsic. He thought that was all there was, but he hoped that if he kind of showed this through the state of nature paradigm, that he could achieve for him and his readers a certain clear-eyedness about where it all comes from and its contingency, but while not undermining our moral convictions. So we don't have to pretend anymore that it comes from God or merely the operation of reason or whatever else it might be. It's actually really much more contingent than that, but because it's ours and we identify with it and we've constructed it through rational, reasonable processes of discussion, it's enough to sustain moral conviction. And I think that was his hope in that project, and that's one of the ways in which I definitely think that Truth and Truthfulness really is a culmination of all of his moral philosophy. And so I think he aimed to liberate us from that sort of anxiety. It's something the liberation might constitute stability under reflection, which is a phrase he sometimes used.
Thank you. It'd be good to have some questions from the floor. So what I think I'd like to do is maybe collect 3 questions, if there are 3 questions, but I would ask you to please keep them very short, and most importantly of all, for them to genuinely be questions. So can I have Jonathan here, you at the back, and the check shirt there.
Thank you for the great talk. My question is to do with John's comment right at the end of your talk about this being an existentialist Williams. And particularly, I'm wondering, is there some sense in which an adherent of like an external reasons view is unfree in virtue of holding that view? And if so, is this something like an instance of bad faith? Or is the failure a failure of truthfulness rather than a failure of freedom? If that makes sense.
Thanks. So up there. That's a good start, Jonathan, keeping it short. Let's carry on.
Thank you. My question concerns the humanism part of the humanistic discipline, because I think in as much as you asked about the freedom, there are so many freedoms, there are so many humanisms. And what exactly is it that makes Williams' naturalistic philosophy humanistic?
Good. And just pass it down, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I was going to ask you about practical necessity, because I was really persuaded by the idea that Williams is a philosopher of freedom, but then there's this idea of the necessity of the requirements for things that matter to us personally. I would really like to hear how that fits in.
I didn't hear that, but you really like to hear what? The very last bit?
How practical necessity which is quite important for him, fits into this notion of ethical freedom.
How practical necessity fits into his notion of ethical freedom. Got it, thank you.
So if you answer those quickly enough, you could potentially have more questions. Just as an incentive.
Thank you. But they're all huge questions. How can I put... Okay.
I've seen you do it.
Let me try. So thank you very much. Yes, existentialism. So I'll just, speak freely. I suspect that Williams really did not like Sartre's work, or Sartre. But there definitely is an existentialist flavour to some of the things that Williams says, and I'm pretty confident that he will have studiously avoided using any notions like bad faith and so on in print, because it would have seemed to align him with a philosophy that he thought was rife with even more fantasies than the morality system. And so when I said it, I can't remember if I left it in, I talked about an adolescent existentialist attitude. Maybe I deleted that word and didn't read it out. But I was saying that Williams wanted to avoid any adolescent existentialist idea of I'm free, I'm going to make my decisions, just me right now, throw away the full moral rule book. That was something Williams would have thought was just silly, I believe. I feel like if Williams was here, I'm sure he'd be disagreeing with everything. So I'm just sort of taking liberties and saying what I think. He is so hard to interpret, but then what can I do? I'm going to say what I think he believed, but of course it's just me. But certainly in conversation, at least once, in discussing what it is that provides reasons with their authority, and so I've said today, he thought he comes through conversation and because they're our own. And there's a kind of ownership. I've sometimes thought about trying to write about Williams through the notion of ownership of concepts, ownership of the ethical knowledge that we can achieve by applying concepts that we own. And I mean it in the psychological sense, because in Ethics and the Limits, as some of you will remember, he talks about how reflection can destroy ethical knowledge. And what he means by that is that good kinds of critical reflection can destroy our psychological loyalty, if you like, to certain sorts of concepts. We can come to think these are not concepts we want to live by anymore, and thereby press them out of service. And then, because we don't own them in that psychological sense, or approve of them in the more normative sense, we can no longer achieve ethical knowledge through their application. It's not our own anymore. We can still use them, and we might achieve, as it were, sociological knowledge. Someone counts as unchaste by behaving this way, but I don't use the word unchaste anymore, so I can't have ethical knowledge that employs that concept. So I think the notion of psychological owning is actually really important in thinking about certain theses of Williams. And so there is that, but he did, as I said, on at least one occasion say, but yes, at base, there's something existential there. So our owning, what I'm calling our owning, I do think he could have thought of it as just who we are. It's our identity, and he could have used the word existential, but I think he carefully didn't ever imprint. And you said, is it a failure of freedom or a failure of truthfulness, the morality system? Definitely, I would say truthfulness. I don't know of anything Williams wrote or said that makes so much of this thing of free. I don't want to make too big a deal of freedom. I just want to mean by ethical freedom exactly what he was talking about when he was talking about the exercise of trustful conversation and the construction and discovery of reasons, etc., etc. So it's my label. And his incredible wariness of all labels, which is part of what makes him hard, is for a reason, because as soon as you use a label, it usually comes with all sorts of associations, and probably half of them he wanted to dissociate himself from. So that's why. But anyway, truthfulness rather than a failure of freedom, along with notions of bad faith and so on, I would say. I don't think he didn't really want to go there. He just thought it was a lie. We should just pull ourselves together and stop fantasizing. Humanism, can I explain the humanism side of the humanistic discipline? The main, at least as I read him, the main sort of flavour of his using the word humanism connects with him trying to encourage a less a prioristic conception of philosophy than is often the case, as well as a non-reductive naturalism, because you can find reductive forms of naturalism in philosophy too, where various aspects of human life, whether it's our psychological states or our moral life or whatever, are just reduced to something physical. He thought that was very alien. And also, he thought that philosophy should be considered, rather than reducing to either something purely a priori or something merely naturalistic and naturalized in that sort of Quinean sense, we should think of it as more like history. It's a humanistic discipline in that sense. I've lost the person who asked this question. Thank you. And so that's at least my take on the paper. Philosophy as a Humanistic Discipline in particular sets out that sort of structure, that we shouldn't think that philosophy has to constrain itself to just what can be done from the armchair. It ought to mix with history, its neighbouring, its sister humanistic discipline, and that will sort of fix it as a humanism. Whereas if we get drawn too much into cognitive science and or just logic, we're missing something. So that's what I think he was trying to emphasize. And then there are other aspects of the favourite which are to do with as it were, earlier concepts of humanism, where humanism is doing the role of saying these things are the result of human rationality rather than given from God. If you're a humanist, you're not saying everything's from God. He too, of course, thought that, but as it were, the godlike figure in the picture is more Kantian ideas of pure rationality being all we need to generate morally contentful injunctions. And he just didn't believe that it could. So in that sense, too, a humanist. And then the last question about how practical necessity fits into ethical freedom. I'm not sure I totally grasp I'm not sure if I'll manage to answer exactly what you were hoping for, but there's a question that he addresses, which is an important one for anyone who isn't a Kantian. He'll say, obviously I'll need to account for the possibility of practical necessity. How come if there isn't a morality system and, there's no consequentialist theory that will require us to do something and no pure practical reason that will show we have this requirement? I better, clearly practical necessity is a feature of moral life, of ethical life, he thought, and he wanted to try and vindicate that and not merely debunk it. What he wanted to debunk was certain accounts of it. And he goes back to ancient Greek thought on the whole. And so shame and necessity is the place to look for most, I would say, in terms of what did Williams give us to substantiate ideas of practical necessity. And this is sort of back to the first question in a way, whether it's sort of existential flavour. I mean, in France, I remember in one place when he's discussing eidos, which I'm probably mispronouncing. My former colleagues will tell me how better to pronounce it. He gives the example of Ajax, who has, in ways I won't go into, sort of made a complete fool of himself in certain ways. And Ajax kills himself because he can't face, as it were, seeing himself reflected in others' eyes, but in particular in the eyes of his father, Telemachus, if I'm not mistaken. And so Ajax just must. This is an example of practical necessity. There's nothing else for it for Ajax, given what he cares most about in the world, but to end his life now. And that's meant to be one example. And it's not, and it's clearly not a sort of objective requirement in some. It comes from who he is, what matters most to him, and the fact that what has happened and how he has performed and been made a fool of in this way is something he cannot live with in the eyes of the people he most respects. And that idea of what you can live with in the eyes of people you respect and who respect you is a recurring theme in Williams' work, in particular in connection with blame, when he tries to explain how blame that isn't too wedded to the morality system might actually work. So a kind of basic idea of why you care about your behaviour and what might produce practical necessities for you. It's not because what will people think, it's because who I am depends on being able to, as it were, hold myself up as worthy of respect in the eyes of those that I respect. And hopefully most of the time that might just prompt remorse rather than suicide, but the Ajax example is a highly dramatic example of that thing. So I think it's a highly social conception of how we can end up with things that we care about so much that they generate these practical requirements for us.
That's fantastic. Your reference to Williams being resistant to labels reminds me of the story he told about giving a lecture in Germany. And a student came up afterwards and said, "Professor Williams, I really enjoyed your lecture and would love to join your school. Unfortunately, I am a Kantian." I'm sure we've all really enjoyed Miranda's lecture and have no inhibitions based on labels from joining her school. So can we please thank her for a fantastic performance?